Hi, everyone. Welcome to my channel, Joy and Dementia. It's great to have you here. And I am Laura Smothers Chu. I am the CEO and founder of Befriended Heart, where I help daughters navigate their parents' dementia. And just to go in a little bit more detail, these daughters are actually the secondary caregivers. So what I mean by secondary is we are usually long distance. We're not the person that's living with the parent with dementia. That in my case is my other parent. So my mom is the primary caregiver to my dad. I do know that we have some primary caregivers watching, so welcome to Joy and Dementia. So that being said, I am excited to announce our next guest expert, Lindsey Vajpeyi, who we have here.
Hi.
And we are going to be talking about communicating with a parent with dementia. So in a previous video, I talked about the importance of mindful, loving touch. And Lindsey's going to go into a couple more tips and techniques that we as daughters can use to communicate with our parent with dementia. So, Lindsey, it is great to have you here.
Hi, Laura.
Hi. So Lindsey is the Director of Education and Outreach at Insight Memory Care Center. And Insight is actually based here in the Washington, D.C. area. And honestly, I have been going to Insight presentations since my dad was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment about 6 years ago. So I have probably seen many of the main presentations there. And I just love how informative and how down to earth these presentations are, and they're super educational. And so, regardless of where you are in the US or in the world, I, want to share these great tips with you. Lindsey, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your expertise?
Sure. So like you mentioned, I'm the Director of Education and Outreach at Insight, which basically means I help coordinate most of our services for family caregivers, which include classes at Insight and in the community, facilitate support groups, offer consultations, and then I co-lead a number of programs with some of my colleagues. A little bit about my background, I have a degree in sociology and gender studies, which led to an internship in a retirement community. And that kind of led to about a decade in long-term care working on the activity side of things. So you'll notice in my credentials, it says ADC/MC. That means Activity Director Certified with a specialization in memory care. And towards the end of my tenure in long-term care, I worked with our kind of dementia unit nurse manager and our social worker to go on for additional training and be able to come back and teach a new dementia care philosophy to our staff called the Best Friends approach. So I'm a Best Friends master trainer as well, and also a certified dementia practitioner. And after leaving long-term care and the activity world, I worked at the Alzheimer's Association for a few years and had great access to information and research and connections with the community. And then kind of brought this experience to Insight, where I really enjoy serving families and working directly with those who are living with some form of dementia.
Awesome. Yeah, and Lindsey and I are friends too, because it's great that she actually, from what you and I were talking about, Lindsey, a couple days ago, is that you have an experience being a caregiver too. So, and we've connected through that. So, can you tell us a little bit about that too?
Yeah, it all started when I was young. When I was a kid, I was really close with all four of my grandparents, but especially my two grandmothers. And we would go and see them a couple times a month. And I remember like fighting with my little sister over who got to sleep with grandma. We both really wanted to sleep with grandma. We wanted to do everything with our grandparents, and just really close with them. And when I was in high school, one of my grandmothers was actually moving from her home into a senior apartment in our small town. And in the moving process, she fell and broke her hip and her wrist. And that was kind of my first experience with hands-on caregiving. My mom and I would take turns each evening staying with grandma in her apartment and helping her transfer out of bed to go to the bathroom, helping her in the shower, with the medications, just kind of like what it's like to be a caregiver for hours and hours and hours on end through the night and everything else. And she's had a number of transitions since then and now lives in a nursing home. But a number of years after I actually started working in long-term care, that same grandmother who fell and broke her hip and her wrist had had a number of mini strokes and went on to develop vascular dementia. And so now it's become personal for my family. And she lives in Iowa and I'm in Virginia, so I only get to see her a couple times a year, unfortunately. But that now has shifted me to more of a secondary caregiver role. So I'm not there with her, every day or every week, helping with decisions and interacting, constantly. But I'm now trying to support my aunt and my mom, who are kind of the main points of contact for my grandmother, and helping them understand what she's going through and what her neighbors in her nursing home are going through, and trying to be supportive from afar.
Absolutely. And I think, we as secondary caregivers can really take that burden off of our parent, or, in your case, your mom and your aunt who are the power of attorney for your grandma. I think that we play a really important role.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's just for those primary caregivers to have someone to talk to about what happened. For in my family, it's when, for example, when my mom goes to see my grandma, and I ask how the visit was and what's different and what they did together, and just she has a place where she can talk about what she's experiencing as the primary caregiver.
Absolutely. So we're kind of like a little bit like a support group in the sense that we also know the person, and we understand where our parents coming from when they talk about how stressed out they are, or if they had a really good visit.
Absolutely. And I have a different, I think, frame of reference because, for example, my mom sees my grandmother every week at least, and I only see her twice a year. So when I come and see her, it's just a different experience, both for my grandmother and for me, than it is for my mom or my aunt going to see my grandma every single week.
Absolutely. I can definitely relate to that. So let's get into the communication tips. Speaking of, making those visits. So what are the, top tips and techniques for a long distance daughter who's a secondary caregiver, for her to know in order to improve her visits with her parent with dementia?
Mhm. I think it starts with really thinking about the word communication and what is communication. We think about communication being just like the words that we say and what we hear someone else say, but communication is really the whole message that we bring to an interaction with someone else. And so, kind of widening the scope when we think about communication to not only modifying the things that we say and the way that we say them, but also those nonverbal signals, especially for those who are, loving a person living with dementia. We have to adapt our nonverbal skills. So that includes our tone of voice, our body language, our facial expressions, the way we use touch. And that can really help facilitate a good connection with that person. So communication isn't always about like having a back and forth conversation. It's about how can I connect with this person, really understand what they need, what they want to share with me. How do I feel like I've had a good experience, bringing something to my loved one?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've mentioned this before on in a couple of other videos, but I definitely have that experience with my dad. So the first thing to go for him, about 5 or 6 years ago, was his word finding. And so he would start out like he would have a whole sentence, and then he would get stuck on one word in the middle and just say, "Oh, that thingy," and that was a little bit earlier in the dementia. And then a little bit later, he would start a sentence, and then he would actually forget where he was going with it. And then finally, it got to the point where we are now, where he will try to get a sentence out, but it'll be a little bit jumbled and be hard to understand. So I know for me, I basically, just being his daughter and having known him for so long, I usually have like an idea of what he would have said in the past and probably what he's trying to say. And so I'll actually, respond that way, as if he's saying it, or I'll just answer as if he said as if he said a sentence that made sense that he said in the past, if that makes sense.
Right.
So yeah, I think that it's especially important, like when I'm also talking to him, is that I'm smiling and I'm very I'm approachable. And the tone of voice too is really joyful, because I know for my dad, he kind of became a sponge as far as other people's emotions go, and so he just sucked it all in. And so if anyone is stressed out or sad, he will also be that way.
Right. That's a great example of those nonverbal kind of signals that you're sending. If you're going into the visit feeling really tense or frustrated or exhausted, it's like you're saying, that person becomes that sponge, or sometimes I'll describe it as a mirror. They're kind of reflecting what it is you're putting into that interaction. And so being really self-aware about the way that you're presenting yourself can go a long way to having a good, effective communication with your loved one. And what you were sharing earlier too about the word finding, and you were describing sort of the adaptations that you make as the disease progresses. This is how, I used to handle the situation, and then as things change, now you've been adapting. You just you can't expect your dad to be able to adapt and change the way that he can communicate. It's really up to, that caregiver to be able to change what we do and what we expect from that interaction. So like you were saying, in the earlier stages of the disease, if your loved one is having a difficult time coming up with the word that they want to say, you might just give them, a few more seconds to take the time to produce it. But if you notice that person becoming really frustrated, your dad, what you think he's trying to say, and you can jump in and offer that and help him continue keeping that conversation moving. And as dementia progresses, once you reach more middle stage, it starts to become much more difficult for that person to come up with the word. And that's where, for family caregivers, you kind of know at this point you need to jump in a little bit more to offer that word to help keep the conversation going, or that it's easy for that person living with dementia to lose their train of thought, to become very easily distracted. So that sort of leads me to another tip that I would share, is making sure you're, making the environment such that you're set up for a good experience together. So if you're going to visit your parent and the TV's on and somebody else is talking over here and then the phone's ringing and somebody's got their smartphone out and there's just so much going on, so that's really distracting, and it's hard for the person living with dementia to sort through all of this stimuli and focus on just you. So setting up the environment so that, maybe you are in a smaller location, that you've turned off the TV, that, maybe you even close the blinds so that you don't have the distraction of cars going by, and just setting up the entire environment in a way that will help you really focus on each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a personal story with that, because I took my dad, when I had him stay with me for about a week, my husband and I took him out to lunch. And I noticed that he wasn't finishing his sandwich because he was continuing to be distracted by the TV, right in front of us. And so I actually asked the person that worked at the store if we could just turn off the TV, and no one else was in, the cafe, so it wouldn't have affected anyone else. But, the amount of time that it took my dad to finish lunch was, expedited like twice as fast as it could have been, just because I removed that distraction. And I noticed for my dad, and I think people with dementia in general, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Lindsey, but I mean, like the TV is like the thing, if anything else is going on in the room, the TV is what gets the attention. So it's just something to keep in mind. And the same thing too, I noticed with music for my dad. So listening to music is like a separate activity. You can't have a conversation. I think we as, daughters in our 30s and 40s, or just particularly in this technology era, we're used to doing a lot of things at the same time. And so talking, and we have some like classical music, in the background, and that's just way too much things going on,
Right.
So you could have a conversation, which could be an activity, or you could listen to music, but I wouldn't recommend mixing those.
Right. So that actually brings up another great point about finding a way to do something with your loved one rather than relying entirely on back and forth conversation. So we know for the person as their dementia progresses, it becomes harder to put together those sentences and express them and respond and have this like 50-50 conversation that most families are used to.
Right.
But finding a way to do something together is a good way to communicate your love, to connect with that person. And so, like when I go visit my grandmother, her type of dementia and the way it's affected her brain, she's also very aphasic. It's hard for her to put words together and to keep up a conversation. So a lot of what we do is just do things together. We go kind of around the nursing home, for sort of a walk together, check out different things, stop and talk to different people. It's great when I bring my young children, or if my mom brings her dog, that really gets a great response from my grandma, where there's not this pressure to have a conversation. When my 2-year-old comes up to my grandma, they can just kind of giggle and kiss and hug and smile at each other. And there's not this pressure to remember something or to have this back and forth conversation, which honestly can be exhausting. And maybe as family members, we're trying to talk about something that really isn't of interest or isn't in the reality of the person that we're caring for. Does my grandma really care about hearing every last thing that I've been up to lately and what the kids are up to? No, she'd rather see the kids and hug them and just like have that experience together rather than just talking about it.
Yeah, and I think, the idea of your kids visiting your grandma, they're using all of those things that we just talked about, right? Their tone of voice, the power of touch, and their emotions, because they're so happy to see their grandma. So they're not even, needing to have a conversation to have a really great effect.
Right. And like the power of touch is huge. To just give a hug, to sit and hold hands, or, to kind of rub someone's arm or, help them brush their hair. Actually, just a couple of weeks ago, I was able to go and see my grandmother, and she's in a wheelchair, and it's hard to snuggle with her, like I used to because of the wheelchair being in the way. But I kind of got up next to her on the side and just kind of put my arm around her and leaned in, and she leaned her head into mine, rested on my shoulder. And I couldn't see her face, but my mom was on the other side of the table, and she was like, Grandma really is loving that right now. And later on, my mom was talking with me about how, she's like, I don't think Grandma really gets a lot of touch. Like people help her get dressed and they help her in the bathroom. And when family members come in, they might lean in for a quick hug. But Grandma isn't getting a whole lot of just that really personal, loving touch. So just to sit together without talking and just kind of cuddle. I mean, it was great for me, and I, thought it was great for my grandma, and it was just good validation to hear from my mom, looking at my grandma's face, just how much joy it brought her.
Yeah, and I think too, I feel like when elders or people with dementia are living in assisted living or long-term care, or even if they're living by themselves and they have a home caregiver come, they're kind of getting the functional touch where there's like a goal at the end, for example, bringing them into the shower. But this way, the loving touch, I think, is very intentional, and just the idea that you want to be close to them. You want to provide this, intimate, emotional intimacy that they're maybe not getting. Yeah. So yeah, that's a great point.
Absolutely. Can I also share an example of my grandma of sometimes things don't go as you expect? So I only get to see my grandma usually twice a year. And when I see her, it's for a few hours and then not again for many more months. And my grandma is in a wheelchair. And part of her routine is that she self-propels with her feet kind of around the nursing home. She does not sit in one place very long. And if she does, she likes to be out kind of by the main nurses station where there's all kinds of activity to watch. And so when I go to see her and I'm sitting there, we kind of go to the end of the hall where it's nice and quiet so that we can have, that connection without the distractions. But if we're sitting there too long, pretty soon my grandma just kind of scoots back and she's heading down the hall again. And I have to remind myself not to take that personally. I'm thinking, I only have a few hours with my grandma and it'll be many more months before I see her. But for my grandma, she's got a routine and she's got kind of her comfort zone in this environment where she lives. And I have to remind myself not to take that personally. It doesn't mean that she doesn't love me or she doesn't want to spend time with me. It's just her attention span is very short, and sitting down kind of in this quiet spot at the end of the hall is not her normal environment. And so then it's up to me to adjust and like, okay, grandma's on the move. We're on the move too. Like, let's go walk around together and just be able to go with the flow. It's huge for caregivers. And I think sometimes primary caregivers kind of figure that out because they're with that person so much. But when you're the secondary caregiver and you're coming in and out of that person's, environment, you may not have that kind of day-to-day experience to say, okay, well, this is dad's new thing now or mom's new thing. We have to be the ones to just kind of adjust, go with the flow, like it's fine, and kind of change our expectations of our interaction.
Yeah, for sure. And I think especially if you're visiting their environment, and you're right, they will have a routine, and routines are so good for parents with dementia, by the way. And I think like it was a little different for me when my dad visited me, because I felt like I needed to have some activities sort of like, set up. And what I did, which I think was really helpful, is I kind of did trial and error. I don't know if people do that, if you know Lindsey, but it was super helpful for me because I kind of thought, what are the activities that my dad used to enjoy? Definitely listening to music. I asked my mom, what he likes doing these days. But I had a couple of I had a sticker activity, I had a couple things. And it was interesting. Like when we were doing the puzzle, I noticed that he would only do maybe 15 minutes of activity, and then he would lean back on the couch and kind of put his head back and close his eyes. So I took that to mean, okay, he's probably a little tired of this activity, or he may be tired of activities for the day. Again, it's very much kind of playing it by ear and seeing where my dad is interested in which activity. So I think that's really important too. And what I would ask you, Lindsey, too, is that sometimes, unfortunately, we're not able to visit with our parent with dementia, and we're just talking with them on the phone. So we talked about word finding, and maybe not asking. Well, we didn't talk about this, but I know that you shouldn't ask them a ton of questions when they're on the phone. So what are there any other specific tips that you want to share, just if you're talking with them on the phone?
Sure. I think one of the things is, again, kind of adjusting expectations. So if you're calling your family member, not expecting to have like a 20 or 30-minute conversation or more, keeping it more short and sweet. And in like the verbal communication, you're going to want to simplify the things that you say a little bit. Or if you're asking a question, make it a more pointed question rather than open-ended. Instead of saying like, what did you do today? Which, number one, there may be memory loss that makes that challenging. Number two, that's just such a big question. You might narrow it down a little bit and give just a couple of options. Or, mom says you guys went and did this. That must have been so much fun. And then give your loved one a chance to respond to the things that you said. Also, reminiscing is an amazing tool when you're interacting, when you're communicating with a person living with dementia. So rather than talking about like what you ate for breakfast this morning or some big thing on the news yesterday, talk about those things from years and years ago. Like, oh, Dad, I was remembering that time when we went skiing and you were teaching me how to ski and I remember falling down. And you're just kind of like, you're describing an experience that you had with this person in their long-term memory. So hopefully as you're talking about it with a lot of emotion, that person can kind of get on board with what you're talking about, and they may have something to add to that conversation. Or what they're adding may just be some, like, yeah, that was fun. That was great. I loved that too. And just taking that as kind of a validation that what you're doing is working, and using that like trial and error. Like you said, as you try something out, you see how it works. Or when you're doing an activity like with your dad, you do notice like maybe this works for a while, and now I see that it's been enough. Whether the activity itself has just become too frustrating, or it's just we're expecting something to kind of entertain someone for an hour, when in reality it might be 5 or 10 minutes, and that's it. And so just having kind of like plan A, plan B, plan C, having lots of options on deck, being able to adjust, go with the flow, watch the nonverbal signals of your loved one. I talked about our nonverbal signals, but what can I gather from what my loved one is expressing? Like when your dad was sitting back and putting his head back, like that sent a message to you. So just being really aware of what's my loved one's nonverbal, body language, tone of voice, facial expression showing me, and then I need to adjust.
Yeah, yeah. And I think too, speaking of activities, so the puzzle, I forget how many pieces it was, like more than 100 or something. And I realized that was a lot of
Mhm.
pieces. And so what I ended up doing for Christmas this year was getting him a much like the pieces were much bigger and there were less pieces. And
Yeah.
it was specifically for people with dementia. So I can actually link that in the description below, but he loved that puzzle and he was able to get a lot of pieces together, and I could tell he was not losing interest at all. So I think that's a way of, we talked before about kind of adapting not only for, what they are no longer being stimulated by in the moment, but also as the stages progress, it's going to be puzzles are going to get a lot harder. And so you adjust by getting a different puzzle with less pieces.
Absolutely. And I like what you were saying much earlier in our discussion about your dad, and the things that you don't know, you're finding out from your mom. Well, what are some of dad's favorite songs? Or, well, what kinds of, puzzles is he working on lately? How many pieces is reasonable? And so you're trying to take the things that you know about him and now adapting them for like the current day situation. So, what are some things that we can do together that he really loves? They're part of his routine, part of something we know he enjoys, but you can now share that experience together. An activity isn't just like a thing on the activity calendar in the nursing home at 10 o'clock. It's like every interaction you have with that person, whether it's you're holding hands or you're dancing together in the kitchen or you're working on a jigsaw puzzle together, you know, all of those are activities. And when you're doing it together, it doesn't mean that you're watching that person do the activity like you're testing them.
Right.
Like, for example, with the puzzle with your dad, okay, you realize like this is too much, but maybe dad can hand me all of the blue pieces while I put them together rather than expecting him to be the one, finding how the pieces fit. So it's just this constant like adaptation, go with the flow, trial and error, and feeling okay about that. Like not beating yourself up if something you thought was going to happen didn't quite go the way you expected. It's just like give yourself some grace, try again, learn from your experiences, learn from that primary caregiver, and just day by day, moment by moment.
Yeah, and especially giving yourself grace, but also giving grace to the person with dementia.
Mhm.
That there is a famous quote, and it's escaping me who said it, but the person with dementia is not giving you a hard time; they're having a hard time.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I think it's kind of the same for your parent who's the primary caregiver too. It's extremely stressful to live with a person with dementia from day to day. And so what I found especially helpful is if you are visiting both of your parents, you know stay home with your parent with dementia and do these really great activities that Lindsey just told us about, because that way your parent who's the primary caregiver can actually go out and whether they need to do errands, or they can my mom can get a chair massage or something like that. It really gives her a break. Even if, like in my case, my parents have a paid caregiver that comes in 5 days a week, but still, I mean, my mom really appreciates that me time, and of course we all appreciate me time, so it really makes sense there.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
that's such an important part of being a secondary caregiver is supporting that primary caregiver, which is emotionally supporting that person, but then also giving them a break, spending that time with your dad and be like, Mom, why don't you go out for a couple of hours? Like, go read your book at the coffee shop, go get your nails done, like, go call a friend. Like, I got this. Dad and I are going to spend some time together. It's going to be great. And just relieving some of that pressure from the primary caregiver.
Yeah, yeah. And one other thing too, what if you have, like, let's we were saying about activities, Lindsey. So what if you have five different activities and you say, oh, mom, what mom being the parent with dementia, what would you like to do? Should we do a puzzle? Should we watch TV? Should we listen to music? And maybe like you have five choices of activities. Do you think that would be a good way to ask it, or is there a different way to ask?
Initially, I feel like that's overwhelming. So
Yeah.
you might start with like two options, like, should we go outside for a walk, or should we, flip on some music and, and sing together? And just giving like a couple of options and then watching like how that person responds can be helpful. Having too many options becomes kind of overwhelming. Like if a person has some memory loss and you're listing off, should we do this thing or this thing or this thing or this thing? By the time you say thing 5, they've forgotten what things 1 through 4 were. And so part of it is maybe just giving a couple of options or trying one thing and seeing how it goes. So maybe you don't ask your loved one what they want to do, because often the answer will be like, if you say, do you want to do this? Do you want to go for a walk? Do you want to do a puzzle? The answer
They will say no.
Yeah. And for any of us, if a door-to-door salesman is coming up to my door, I don't even know what they're selling. I just know that like I probably don't understand it or don't want it, and so I just say no, right? I'm not even giving that person a chance. Like your loved one may be doing the same thing. So you might just say, can you help me with this? Like let's say you're doing a puzzle, like you're kind of working on it, and then you draw that person in by asking for their help, which helps boost their self-esteem. Like, oh, yeah, I can help you with that. It gives them a chance to do something with you, to show, their ability, their expertise, their interest in something. So asking that person to help you, to do something with you, is often more useful than, Dad, do you want to do this? And again, it is stage specific. For someone in the early stage, you can ask more of those like, do you want to kinds of questions and have more confidence that the person understands and can make a choice. And as dementia progresses and you're reaching more middle stage to late stage, asking those kinds of questions may not make the same sense that it used to. So it might be finding different ways to engage your loved one rather than kind of asking what they want.
Yeah. And my dad is at the point, he's in the later stages where he'll just say no, even if I say, can you come with me and, come take a walk? So he'll still say no. So what I do now is I say, hey, Dad, let's go for a walk. So I'm changing my tone of voice, I'm changing my body language, and I actually, I hug him or I put my hand on his back and kind of, bring him along. And so that way he'll say, okay, so like we talked about, it will vary, and you'll need to modify it as the levels of dementia progress. But that's the wonderful thing about, the dementia journey is if, you forget to do something or you feel like you made a mistake, it's a whole new day the next day, it's a whole new visit the next time. So, Lindsey, if you had to sum up this interview to one takeaway point specific to long distance secondary caregiving daughters, what would it be?
I would say when you're communicating with that loved one, to really try to find joy in the moment. Try to really appreciate the moment, find all the wonderful ways that you can connect in the moment, and kind of let go of all those expectations that you might have put on that experience, the things that you thought might happen or wanted to happen, expected. When they don't, then we kind of feel defeated. And our loved ones feel that, and it just doesn't set us up for a good interaction. So I would, just try to like live in the moment, find the joy in the moment, try to see the world through the eyes of your loved one and just let that pressure and expectation just fall away.
Yeah, I think that's really great. And I think that really speaks to the channel name, Joy in Dementia, and the fact that we can be empowered through these choices, whether it's, the activity that we choose to do with our parents and creating wonderful memories, or it's, determining what would be the best assisted living place for my parent. There are still some things that we do have control over despite this dementia diagnosis. Mm-hmm. So, Lindsey, it's been wonderful talking with you. And where can we find you?
You can find me at Insight Memory Care Center, which is in Fairfax, Virginia. You can find our website at insightmcc.org. And you can find lots of information there, including an education library that has a number of tip sheets. It has some educational videos. And if you're local, you can find some of our support groups, classes, and other kinds of programming that are available to you. You can always also call me at 703-204-5688. 4664. And I'm happy to talk with you, whether you're near or far, to try to support you in your care of your loved one.
Awesome. So we have Lindsey's digits in case you want to give her a call. And I will also put her email address in the description below of this video in case you prefer email. And it's been really wonderful having you, Lindsey. Thanks so much for being on Joy in Dementia.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you all for tuning in to my channel. And if you want to hear more wonderful interviews or tips that I'll share with you, please subscribe below. Thanks so much. Bye.